Cassian Valacrest sat exactly where men like him always sat, upright, relaxed, assured. His suit was tailored with quiet precision, the kind worn by people who never question whether they belong in powerful rooms. He didn't scan the courtroom. He didn't fidget. He didn't rehearse outcomes in his head. For Cassian, outcomes were assumed. This was not his first legal confrontation, and it showed. His posture carried the ease of someone who had watched systems bend before. Money had always worked on his behalf. Influence had always softened resistance. When obstacles appeared, they tended to move aside with the right signatures and the right voices speaking at the right time. His legal team mirrored his confidence. Their files were neat, their expressions calm, their movements efficient. They spoke in measured tones, already pacing the day toward the conclusion they expected. To them, this case wasn't a battle. It was procedure. Across the room sat Elowyn Hartley. Cassian barely looked at her. That, more than anything else, revealed how certain he felt. He had already decided how this would end. He had already framed her role in the story, cooperative, quiet, eventually grateful for whatever was left. 12 years of marriage had taught him what he believed was her defining trait, restraint. And in his mind, restraint had always meant compliance. He leaned back slightly as proceedings moved forward, listening without urgency. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. Nothing hinted at loss. Cassian Valacrest did not enter the courtroom prepared to defend his empire. He entered believing it could not be touched. The shift did not arrive with raised voices or sudden movement. It came quietly, almost politely. A single document was introduced into the record. There was nothing dramatic about its appearance, no reaction from the judge, no visible tension from Cassian's legal team. Papers were exchanged every few minutes in rooms like this. On the surface, this was routine. Just another page among many, another formality on the path toward an outcome Cassian already expected. But Elowyn noticed the change immediately. She didn't look at Cassian. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't reach for anything. She simply sat still, hands folded, eyes forward, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The room paused. Not officially, not on record, but in the way people pause when something settles into place. Conversations slowed. Pens stopped moving. Even the confidence that had filled the space moments earlier seemed to thin, replaced by something harder to define. Cassian glanced up for the first time. At first, his expression didn't change. He skimmed the page with the same casual focus he brought to contracts and reports. Then he read it again, slower this time. The ease in his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. His jaw set. One of his attorneys leaned closer, eyes narrowing as lines began to connect where separation had once been assumed. Still, no one spoke. That was the moment the silence took weight. Not because anyone was afraid to speak, but because speaking suddenly required certainty. And certainty, for the first time that day, belonged to someone else. Elowyn remained calm, unmoving. She did not look relieved. She did not look satisfied. She looked prepared. For years, Elowyn's quiet had been mistaken for absence. In meetings she attended, but was not addressed. In conversations where her name was spoken without her being consulted. In a marriage where listening had replaced being heard. Silence had followed her like a shadow, useful, unnoticed, easily dismissed. Cassian had built his confidence on that misunderstanding. He believed calm meant concession. That patience meant acceptance. That a woman who did not argue would not resist when resistance required effort. His world rewarded volume, visibility, and control. Those who stayed composed were often stepped around, not stepped aside. But silence, Elowyn had learned, is not empty. It holds memory. It holds observation. It holds choice. As the court reviewed the document, she did not interrupt the unfolding process. She allowed the information to speak in the only language the room respected: structure, sequence, proof. There was no urgency in her expression, no trace of anticipation. This was not a gamble. It was a sequence reaching its proper point. Cassian shifted in his seat. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that something he had not accounted for was now present. His gaze returned to Elowyn, searching for reaction, for confirmation that this was still a negotiation he could steer. She gave him none. The power he had relied on was still there, his wealth, his name, his reach. But power depends on assumption, and the most dangerous assumption he had made was believing silence could not carry intention. In that moment, Elowyn's stillness was no longer passive. It was directive. Cassian finally understood what felt different. But understanding arrived after usefulness had passed. He had spent years believing that control revealed itself through command. That authority required presence, direction, pressure. What he failed to recognize was the danger of someone who did not rush to respond, someone who observed long enough to act only once. As the court moved forward, it became clear that Elowyn had not been waiting for permission. She had been waiting for alignment, for facts to meet sequence, for truth to stand without decoration. Cassian's confidence faltered, not because he had been exposed emotionally, but because the structure he trusted no longer responded to him alone. Every glance at his legal team carried a question he did not want to ask out loud. Every pause stretched longer than expected. Elowyn did not look at him. That was the moment he realized she wasn't bracing herself for loss. She wasn't hoping for fairness. She wasn't preparing to recover from defeat. She had already moved past the outcome he was still clinging to. If you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, if you've ever been mistaken for powerless, simply because you chose restraint, you understand the danger Cassian walked into without noticing. Systems are built to reward noise, but they collapse when clarity arrives fully formed. This story isn't about outrage or spectacle. It's about what happens when preparation meets timing. And if stories of quiet justice, unseen strength, and people reclaiming themselves speak to you, this is your place. Subscribe to Midnight Story Vault for stories where truth doesn't need permission to stand. Before Cassian Valacrest became a figure people deferred to, he was simply a man with ideas that outpaced his resources. There were no assistants managing his calendar, no legal teams shaping his language, no boardrooms waiting for his arrival. There was only ambition, unrefined, restless, and uncertain of its own future. He worked long hours then, not out of dominance but necessity. His days were filled with proposals that went unanswered, and meetings that ended with polite refusals. Progress came slowly, in fragments, and success felt distant enough to be fragile. Cassian spoke often about what he hoped to build, but his voice carried more intention than confidence. At night, exhaustion softened his sharpness, and doubt crept in quietly. That was the version of Cassian Elowyn met. He wasn't powerful yet. He was driven. And there is a difference between the two. In those early years, Cassian was open in ways he would later abandon. He explained his thinking, questioned his own assumptions, and listened when Elowyn challenged him. His ambition was still something he shared, not something he guarded. When plans fell through, he didn't retreat into silence. He talked. He recalibrated. He tried again. There were moments when his confidence wavered entirely, when he questioned whether his goals were realistic or whether he had misunderstood his own potential. Elowyn saw those moments clearly. She saw the uncertainty he hid from everyone else, the pressure he placed on himself to become someone worthy of his vision. What bound them then wasn't success. It was belief. Cassian believed he could build something meaningful. Elowyn believed he could do it without losing himself. That shared faith formed the foundation of their relationship long before anything tangible existed to prove it was justified. Back then, his name carried no weight beyond their small circle. It didn't open doors or command attention. It simply identified him as a man still becoming who he hoped to be. And in those days, before power arrived to rearrange everything, Cassian Valacrest was not yet untouchable. He was human. Elowyn Hartley did not enter Cassian's life as a spectator. From the beginning, she was involved in the shaping of his ambitions, even when her contribution went unnamed. She was present in the seasons when plans were fragile and outcomes uncertain, when progress depended not on influence but on endurance. While Cassian chased opportunities, Elowyn created stability. She managed what little they had with intention, ensuring that scarcity did not turn into chaos. When his focus narrowed toward the future, hers widened to include the present, rent that had to be paid, schedules that had to be maintained, and emotional steadiness that had to be protected so his doubts didn't swallow him whole. She read drafts of proposals late at night, offering perspective without insisting on credit. She listened as Cassian rehearsed ideas aloud, helping him refine arguments before they ever reached another room. Sometimes her role was practical. Sometimes it was emotional. Often, it was both at once. Eloin believed in the work, but more than that, she believed in the version of Cassian that existed before success began reshaping him. She challenged him when his expectations drifted too far from reality and grounded him when his confidence faltered. Her presence was not decorative, it was structural. There were moments when her own ambitions took a quieter form so his could breathe, not because she lacked direction, but because partnership required prioritization. She understood that building something together sometimes meant one person carrying more visible weight while the other reinforced the foundation beneath it. Cassian noticed this then. He acknowledged it. He thanked her for it. In those early years, Eloin was not standing beside power. She was helping construct the framework it would later rest upon. Decisions were discussed, not declared. Plans were adjusted collaboratively. When sacrifices were made, they were shared, not assumed. What existed between them was not hierarchy. It was alignment, and although no formal agreement was ever spoken aloud, Eloin operated. With a quiet certainty, what they were building belonged to both of them, not because she demanded ownership, but because contribution creates entitlement, long before recognition ever does. At that stage, love felt mutual not because it was easy, but because effort flowed in both directions. Eloin was not supporting a future she would later be excluded from. She was shaping it. In those early years, their life together was shaped less by achievement and more by conversation. Progress unfolded slowly, measured in evenings spent planning rather than results secured. They talked late into the night, not because they were chasing romance, but because dreaming required time and attention. Ideas were spoken aloud, dismantled, rebuilt, and reshaped, until they felt solid enough to carry forward. Their plans were rarely grand in the way success stories later describe. They spoke about sustainability before expansion, stability before visibility. Cassian imagined structures and influence. Eloin imagined longevity. Where he focused on reaching the next level, she focused on what would keep them standing once they arrived there. Those differences didn't divide them. They complemented each other. Sacrifice was not framed as loss then. It was simply the cost of building something that did not yet exist. Vacations were postponed. Comfort was delayed. Social circles shifted as priorities narrowed. Eloin accepted these changes, not because she lacked desire for more, but because she believed timing mattered. Cassian noticed her willingness to wait and mistook it for limitless patience. There were moments when exhaustion settled heavily between them. Times when Cassian's setbacks drained the room of optimism. Eloin absorbed those moments quietly, not by dismissing his frustration, but by anchoring it. She reminded him of progress already made, of obstacles already survived. When confidence wavered, she reinforced it, not with reassurance alone, but with perspective. They built routines that revolved around possibility rather than certainty. Shared calendars marked deadlines rather than celebrations. Their sense of togetherness came from collaboration, not comfort. What they lacked in luxury, they compensated for in alignment. During that time, the future felt collective. Success was imagined as something they would step into side by side. Cassian spoke about when rather than if, and Eloin believed him, not blindly, but deliberately. Trust was not something she offered lightly. It was something she constructed through consistency and shared effort. Those years formed an emotional contract without language, one that assumed mutual recognition, one that rested on the understanding that sacrifice, when shared, creates ownership. They were not building parallel lives, they were building one. What bound Cassian and Eloin most firmly in those years was not romance in its dramatic form, but an understanding that never needed to be stated aloud. They did not sit down to outline terms or define roles. There were no declarations about ownership or entitlement. What existed between them was quieter, and at the time, stronger for it. Everything they built came from shared ground. When Cassian spoke about the future, he spoke in plural. When Eloin planned around his goals, she did so with the assumption that her place within them was secure. This was not arrogance. It was trust shaped by consistency. She had been present for every early decision, every recalibration, every compromise that made growth possible. Her involvement wasn't conditional, it was foundational. They lived with the belief that contribution created permanence. That effort, when sustained over time, became its own form of claim. Cassian's ambitions were never framed as something that would eclipse their partnership. They were framed as an extension of it. The life they envisioned was not divided into his success and her support. It was imagined as shared arrival. Eloin operated under the certainty that when recognition eventually came, it would not erase history. That progress would not invalidate partnership. That love, having been built through uncertainty, would not fracture once certainty arrived. Cassian reinforced this belief then, not through promises, but through behavior. He consulted her. He adjusted plans based on her insight. He acknowledged her influence when decisions turned in their favor. Those moments were small, but they accumulated. They taught Eloin that she was not replaceable, not peripheral, not temporary. The danger of unspoken contracts is not their existence, it is forgetting they were ever made. As success approached, neither of them paused to renegotiate what had been assumed. Cassian did not consider how power would alter his perception of contribution. Eloin did not consider that visibility might eventually outweigh memory. They moved forward under the belief that what had carried them through uncertainty would remain intact under abundance. That belief made sense at the time. After all, empires are often built on quiet agreements long before they are tested by visibility, and in those years before power rearranged everything, Eloin had no reason to believe. She would one day need to defend her place in something she helped create. The foundation felt solid. It had not yet been shaken. As Cassian's world expanded, Eloin's position within it began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to escape immediate notice. Nothing was taken from her outright. No boundary was clearly drawn. Instead, space slowly formed around her, quiet and undefined, until she realized she was no longer standing at the center of the life they had once shared. Cassian's schedule grew crowded with meetings, calls, and commitments that carried urgency she was not invited to share. Conversations that once unfolded at home now happened elsewhere, wrapped in language Eloin was no longer asked to engage with. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently, often without her presence, not out of cruelty, but convenience. At first, she adjusted without complaint. She understood growth required focus. She told herself this was temporary, that proximity would return once stability was secured. She learned how to attend without interrupting, how to listen without inserting herself, how to be present without demanding space. Rooms changed. The people around Cassian changed. Eloin noticed how easily attention slid past her, as if she were part of the setting rather than the conversation. She stood beside him at gatherings where his name carried recognition, while hers was mentioned less often, sometimes not at all. This absence did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. Eloin remained where she had always been, supportive, composed, patient. She believed that love endured through adjustment. That stepping back was not erasure, but trust. That closeness could survive distance if intention remained intact. She did not yet see that the shift was not only external, it was internal, a gradual repositioning that left her visible enough to be useful, but distant enough to be overlooked. And so she stayed, believing presence alone was enough to secure her place beside power. The changes became most apparent in rooms where introductions mattered. Eloin noticed it first in the way Cassian was announced. His name arrived ahead of him, often followed by titles, achievements, and expectations. People stood straighter when he approached. Conversations shifted direction without explanation. When it was her turn, the language softened. She was described in relation to him rather than as herself. Her identity was compressed into a role, wife, partner, presence, stripped of the context that once gave it weight. Introductions shortened. Details were omitted. Her history became unnecessary in spaces where Cassian's future commanded attention. At first, Eloin accepted this without resistance. She understood that visibility came with hierarchy, and hierarchy favored those who produced outcomes others wanted access to. She smiled politely, responded when spoken to, and allowed conversations to move past her without insistence. Courtesy became her default, not because she lacked confidence, but because she believed harmony mattered more than recognition. Boardrooms were no different. She sat through discussions where strategies were laid out without reference to her earlier involvement. Decisions were made as if they existed independently of the groundwork she had helped establish. Cassian rarely noticed the omission. To him, progress meant motion, and motion required speed. Eloin observed how easily people assumed her place was ornamental rather than integral. She watched others speak over her with casual familiarity, confident she would not challenge them. She rarely did, not because she agreed, but because she believed patience preserved connection. Each introduction that minimized her, each moment where her contribution went unnamed, reinforced a belief she carried quietly: love required accommodation, that waiting was a form of loyalty, that insisting on space risked disruption. What she did not realize was how often silence invites reinterpretation, and how easily presence, when unasserted, can be mistaken for absence. Eloin told herself a story that made the distance survivable. She believed patience was devotion expressed quietly, that love did not require constant reassurance to remain intact. Cassian was building something demanding, something that required focus and sacrifice, and she chose to interpret his absence as investment rather than neglect. When he arrived home late, she adjusted her expectations. When conversations shortened, she filled the silence with understanding. She reminded herself that this phase was transitional, that once momentum slowed, closeness would return. She had seen him under pressure before. She trusted that intensity did not erase attachment. It merely postponed it. So she waited. She learned how to measure love in restraint rather than reciprocity, how to equate endurance with commitment. When she felt unseen, she questioned her sensitivity instead of the situation. When loneliness surfaced, she pushed it aside, telling herself that demanding more would be unfair while so much was at stake. Cassian rarely asked for this patience outright. He didn't need to. Eloin offered it freely, believing generosity strengthened connection. She assumed that choosing understanding over confrontation protected what they had built together. Over time, this belief shaped her responses. She stopped interrupting his work with questions that might slow him down. She softened concerns before voicing them, often dismissing them entirely. She adapted her needs to fit into the narrow spaces left open. What felt like love to her began to function like self-erasure. The danger wasn't that Cassian demanded silence. It was that Eloin convinced herself silence was evidence of loyalty. She mistook her ability to endure for proof that the relationship was still balanced. And each time she chose patience over expression, she moved one step further from the life they once shared, without realizing how far she had already traveled alone. Loneliness did not arrive as absence. Cassian was still there, physically present, returning home, occupying space. But emotionally, something had shifted beyond reach. Eloin found herself sharing rooms without sharing moments, speaking into spaces where attention no longer settled. Their conversations became functional. Logistics replaced curiosity. Updates replaced intimacy. Cassian spoke about his days in fragments, edited for efficiency, while Eloin listened, without interrupting, careful not to demand more than he seemed willing to offer. She learned how to receive partial presence and convince herself it was sufficient. Evenings passed quietly. Cassian's focus often lingered elsewhere. His mind engaged with matters Eloin no longer felt invited into. When she spoke about her own thoughts or experiences, she sensed the delay in his responses, the way his attention had to travel back to her before it could engage. Over time, she began to speak less. This distance did not provoke argument. There were no raised voices, no clear moment where separation declared itself. Instead, connection thinned gradually, stretched across obligations and expectations until it lost its elasticity. Elowyn remained committed, but commitment no longer felt mutual. She was married, yet increasingly solitary. The most difficult part was not being alone. It was being unseen while standing beside the person who once noticed everything. Cassian did not reject her outright. He simply stopped reaching, and Elowyn, having learned to adapt rather than insist, met him where he was, even as it left her behind. She told herself this was what support looked like. That enduring quiet was a necessary phase. That closeness would return once pressure eased. But pressure rarely releases without consequence. And as Cassian's world grew louder and more demanding, Elowyn's grew quieter, narrower, until the space meant for partnership held only one voice. She was still married. She was still present. And yet, she was already learning how to live emotionally alone. The changes in Cassian did not arrive with excuses or explanations. They surfaced quietly, folded into routine, easy to overlook if one was not paying attention. Elowyn noticed them because she always had, not as suspicion, but as awareness shaped by years of intimacy. His habits shifted first. Calls he once took openly were now answered elsewhere. Messages were returned with speed, but not in her presence. When he traveled, details thinned, timelines blurred. He spoke about his movements with confidence, yet without substance, as if precision no longer mattered at home. Affection followed the same pattern. It appeared when expected, rather than when felt. Gestures arrived on schedule, not impulse. Touch became brief, almost ceremonial, offered as reassurance rather than connection. Cassian was still kind, still attentive in appearance, but something essential had flattened. Warmth was replaced by correctness. Elowyn did not confront him. She told herself that pressure explained everything. That responsibility changes people. That success demands focus and drains softness. She reviewed their life together, searching for a moment she might have misunderstood, a need she had failed to articulate. And then she paused. She asked herself whether love should feel rehearsed, whether closeness should require preparation, whether absence could exist even when someone was present every day. These questions arrived uninvited, and she resisted them at first. Doubt felt disloyal. Observation felt dangerous. She did not want to imagine betrayal where none had been proven. So she watched instead. She noticed patterns without naming them. She stored moments without assigning meaning. She chose awareness over accusation, believing certainty mattered more than reaction. Still, something pressed at the edges of her attention. The silence between them no longer felt neutral. It was beginning to demand acknowledgement. Elowyn began to sense the difference in the smallest exchanges. Cassian still reached for her hand, still offered a smile, still asked how her day had been, but the gestures felt timed, delivered with intention rather than instinct. What once flowed naturally now appeared measured, as though affection had become another responsibility to manage. Compliments arrived predictably, often when he sensed distance. A brief touch followed moments of distraction. Apologies came quickly, but without depth, closing conversations before they could open fully. Cassian was attentive in form, yet absent in substance. His presence felt split, anchored in the room but directed elsewhere. Elowyn noticed how rarely he lingered, how easily he disengaged once reassurance had been given. Intimacy no longer carried curiosity, it served function, proof that nothing was wrong, confirmation that routine remained intact. She questioned herself often. Was she asking for too much? Was this simply how long marriages evolved under pressure? She replayed earlier years in her mind, comparing warmth then to restraint now, wondering whether change was inevitable or whether she was misreading something ordinary as loss. These reflections did not lead her to accusation. They led her inward. She adjusted her expectations again, telling herself that love expressed differently was still love. That stability sometimes looked quiet. That demanding emotional access during demanding seasons was unfair. But the doubt did not disappear. It settled instead, patient and persistent. Elowyn felt it most in moments that should have felt close. Shared meals, quiet evenings, familiar spaces where comfort once lived easily. Even then, she sensed distance she could not cross. She did not voice this discomfort. She did not test his explanations. She continued to observe, believing truth revealed itself more clearly when left undisturbed. Yet each rehearsed gesture carried an unintended message. Connection was being maintained, not experienced. And Eloin began to understand that when affection must be scheduled, something essential has already shifted. Eloin understood the weight of a question once it was spoken. Accusation, even when tentative, altered the shape of a relationship. It forced defense. It invited denial. And if she was wrong, it would fracture something that still mattered to her. So she chose restraint. Instead of asking Cassian where he had been, she noted when answers arrived without detail. Instead of questioning sudden changes, she tracked their frequency. She paid attention to what remained consistent and what quietly disappeared. This was not suspicion sharpened by fear, but attentiveness guided by instinct. She watched how Cassian positioned his phone when he sat beside her, how he shifted when notifications appeared, how conversations ended abruptly when certain names surfaced. None of these moments were conclusive on their own. Together, they formed a pattern that unsettled her. Still, she did not speak. Eloin believed that truth carried its own rhythm, that rushing it forward could distort what needed clarity. She wanted certainty, not confrontation fueled by doubt. She wanted understanding that could stand without explanation. There were moments when the urge to ask pressed heavily against her restraint, when silence felt like complicity rather than patience. In those moments, she paused and examined her motivation. Was she seeking reassurance, or was she seeking reality? That distinction mattered. She reminded herself that accusation without proof offered temporary relief, but permanent damage. If something was wrong, she wanted to see it clearly. If nothing was wrong, she did not want to introduce fracture where there was none. So she continued to watch, to listen, to note inconsistencies without reacting to them. Each day added another layer of awareness. Each unanswered question sharpened her perception rather than dulling it. What Cassian mistook for trust was, in truth, discipline. Eloin was not avoiding the truth. She was allowing it enough space to reveal itself fully. Waiting carried a cost. Eloin did not calculate at first. Each day she delayed confrontation. She absorbed uncertainty alone. Questions gathered without answers. Doubt lingered without resolution. She maintained composure outwardly while managing unease internally, careful not to disturb the balance she still hoped could be preserved. There were nights when she lay awake reviewing moments that no longer aligned. She replayed conversations, searching for reassurance she might have missed. She examined her own behavior with scrutiny, asking whether she had grown distant first, whether she had failed to adapt quickly enough to the pace of Cassian's world. These reflections did not bring clarity, they brought exhaustion. Eloin noticed how much energy uncertainty required, how vigilance replaced rest, how attention stayed alert even in moments meant for ease. She carried questions into routine tasks, into conversations that no longer felt grounding. Waiting to be sure demanded patience, but it also demanded emotional isolation. Still, she did not rush. She believed certainty was worth the discomfort, that acting too soon risked misjudgment, that clarity, once reached, would justify the weight she carried quietly. She accepted loneliness as the price of restraint, but restraint began to reshape her. She stopped expecting openness. She prepared herself for disappointment before it arrived. The distance she once endured with trust, she now endured with caution. Even hope began to feel conditional. Eloin understood then that silence was no longer neutral. It was active, pressing, insistent. It demanded resolution, not endurance. Waiting had sharpened her awareness, but it had also revealed the cost of remaining suspended between knowing and speaking. Something had shifted irreversibly, and although she had not yet named what was wrong, she could no longer ignore that the silence between them was no longer empty. It was asking to be answered. Eloin discovered the first fracture not through emotion, but through order. Managing shared finances had always been part of her responsibility. It was practical, familiar, and predictable. Numbers, after all, followed rules. They aligned when treated honestly. They balanced when nothing was hidden. For years, the system had behaved exactly as expected, until it didn't. At first, the inconsistencies were small. A charge routed differently than usual. Travel expenses logged twice in places that should have overlapped cleanly. Transfers that moved smoothly, yet left faint gaps where clarity should have existed. Nothing alarming on its own. Nothing dramatic enough to demand confrontation. Eloin assumed error before intention. She reviewed statements again, slower this time. She cross-checked dates, locations, and amounts. Patterns began to form where randomness should have lived. Trips extended by hours that were never mentioned. Expenses that aligned too neatly with absences explained vaguely. The figures told a story Cassian never had. Still, she hesitated. She questioned her interpretation, her sensitivity, her impulse to look deeper. She reminded herself that complex work created complex records. That success generated layers she might not fully understand anymore. Doubt, she told herself, was not evidence. So she paused. Then she noticed repetition. The same unfamiliar routing appeared again and again, always subtle, always defensible, always positioned where oversight assumed trust rather than scrutiny. Eloin felt the shift then, not fear, not anger, but alertness sharpened by recognition. These were not mistakes. They were choices. Her breath steadied as she continued reviewing the records, no longer searching for reassurance. She searched for confirmation, and as the numbers aligned into something deliberate, Eloin understood that whatever she was uncovering had been placed there with confidence. Confidence that she would not look closely. Confidence that she would not connect what was never meant to be examined together. The betrayal had not announced itself, but it had left a trail written in numbers, and numbers, unlike people, do not lie without instruction. It was the repetition that changed everything. Eloin noticed the name first because it didn't belong. It appeared attached to bookings, to transfers, to moments that were meant to be neutral. At a glance, it looked incidental, just another contact in a growing network of professional interactions. But repetition has a way of demanding attention. The name surfaced again days later, then again weeks apart, always connected to time Cassian had accounted for vaguely. Never prominent, never emphasized, always placed where it could pass unnoticed unless someone was already looking closely. Eloin did not react immediately. She returned to earlier records, tracing backward, aligning dates with locations. Timelines that had once felt harmless began to overlap. Trips explained as work commitments coincided with entries she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Hours extended, movements overlapped, gaps appeared where transparency should have existed. She checked calendars, messages, travel confirmations. The pieces began to fit together with unsettling precision. What unsettled her most was not the presence of another person. It was the consistency of concealment, the careful spacing, the restraint, the confidence with which the same name appeared without concern for discovery. This was not carelessness. It was calculation shaped by familiarity. Eloin sat with the information longer than necessary, allowing herself time to feel nothing before feeling everything. She did not cry. She did not panic. She felt a slow tightening instead, the kind that arrives when realization settles fully into place. This was not a moment of doubt anymore. It was alignment. The timelines did not contradict each other. They supported one another. Each record reinforced the last. And as the pattern completed itself, Eloin understood that what she was seeing had existed long enough to assume safety. Safety built on her trust. Safety built on the belief that she would not question what was never explained. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a name. There is a moment when questioning ends, not because answers are complete, but because doubt no longer serves its purpose. Eloin reached that moment quietly, without ceremony, sitting alone with information she could no longer rearrange into something harmless. She reviewed everything one final time, not to search for error, but to confirm consistency. The numbers aligned. The timelines supported each other. The name appeared where it should not have, too often, and too precisely to excuse. What had once felt ambiguous now felt intentional. Certainty did not arrive with shock. It arrived with clarity. Eloin noticed how calm she became once uncertainty lifted. The effort of wondering had been heavier than the truth itself. Questions no longer circled endlessly. They settled, and in that stillness, understanding took shape fully. Cassian had not slipped. He had planned. He had arranged his life carefully enough to assume she would remain, where she had always been, trusting, accommodating, unthreatening. He had not accounted for her attention. He had not imagined she would examine what was placed quietly in her care. Eloin felt the shift then, not toward confrontation, but toward assessment. Betrayal was no longer something she feared naming incorrectly. It was something she understood clearly. And understanding, once achieved, changed how she positioned herself entirely. She did not confront him that day. She did not hint at awareness. She did not seek reassurance or explanation. Certainty removed the need for reaction. What remained was choice. Eloin realized that the most revealing part of what she had uncovered was not the affair itself. It was the assumption beneath it, the belief that she was passive, that she would not look closely, that she would accept surface explanations without scrutiny. In that moment, the betrayal became complete. Not because another person existed, but because Cassian had built the entire deception on the belief that Eloin would never notice. The betrayal itself was painful, but it was not the deepest wound. What unsettled Eloin most was the logic behind it. Cassian had not relied on secrecy alone. He had relied on her predictability. He had measured her reactions based on years of patience and restraint, concluding that she would never question what was presented calmly and without disruption. He believed her trust was static. That belief reshaped everything she had uncovered. The affair was not hidden recklessly or impulsively. It was positioned within the architecture of her loyalty. Cassian assumed she would continue to prioritize harmony over inquiry, endurance over examination. He assumed that because she had waited before, she would always wait. Eloin understood then that she had not been deceived because she lacked awareness. She had been underestimated because she possessed it quietly. This realization settled heavily, not as anger, but as resolve. She saw how easily her silence had been misinterpreted, how her steadiness had been reframed as absence, how years of contribution had been dismissed as background. The deception had been constructed with care, not to avoid discovery, but to survive it. Cassian believed that even if something surfaced, it would dissolve under explanation. That trust, once established, would absorb contradiction without consequence. He had not prepared for scrutiny. Eloin did not feel the urge to confront him or demand acknowledgement. Recognition did not require his confirmation. What mattered now was understanding the nature of the mistake he had made. He had not simply betrayed their marriage. He had dismissed her capacity to see clearly. And that dismissal changed how she viewed everything that came next. It shifted her from reaction to intention, from hurt to strategy, from participation to preparation. Cassian believed the risk lay in exposure. Eloin understood the real risk lay in assumption. And once she recognized that, the balance between them had already begun to change. Eloin did not go quiet because she was afraid. She went quiet because she decided to. After certainty settled, the urge to confront came and went in waves. There were moments when words lined up in her mind, questions sharpened by precision, statements weighted with truth. She could have spoken. She could have demanded explanation, watched Cassian attempt reassurance, listened as familiar patterns reasserted themselves. The option was there, obvious and accessible. She chose otherwise. Eloin understood something then that she had not understood before. Confrontation would not give her information. It would only give Cassian an opportunity to manage perception, to explain selectively, to redirect focus, to dilute clarity with emotion. Silence, on the other hand, preserved what she had learned exactly as it was. This was not avoidance. It was control. By choosing stillness, Eloin reclaimed authority over her response. She refused to offer her certainty prematurely. She refused to make her understanding negotiable. What she held now did not need validation. It needed protection. Hurt was present, but it no longer governed her behavior. The initial ache had sharpened into awareness, and awareness demanded discipline. She recognized how quickly emotion could compromise precision, how easily pain could be used against the person expressing it. Eloin would not allow that, so she continued as before, calm, attentive, engaged where necessary. Cassian noticed nothing different. His routines remained intact, his assumptions undisturbed. Eloin allowed this deliberately. Inside, however, something had shifted permanently. She was no longer waiting for him to explain himself. She was no longer hoping for reassurance that might restore what had already fractured. Silence had become a boundary, not a void. A choice to observe without interference, to move without announcement. In choosing quiet, Eloin was not shrinking. She was consolidating, gathering clarity without scattering it through reaction, preparing herself not for confrontation, but for consequence. And in that moment, without raising her voice or changing her behavior, Eloin made the most decisive choice of her marriage. She stopped reacting. She started deciding. The hurt did not disappear simply because Eloin chose silence. It remained, present but contained, no longer spilling into her actions. What changed was how she related to it. Pain stopped demanding expression and began offering information. In the early days after certainty settled, emotions surfaced unexpectedly. It appeared in quiet moments, in pauses between tasks, in familiar spaces that now felt altered. Eloin allowed herself to feel it fully, but privately. She did not rush to transform pain into words or explanations. She let it exist without narrative. This restraint created space. Without the need to perform reaction, Eloin began to think with unusual clarity. She examined her marriage not as something she was still trying to protect, but as something she needed to understand accurately. Patterns she had once softened in her mind now stood plainly. Moments she had excused revealed their shape more honestly. She noticed how often she had carried emotional weight alone, how frequently she had adjusted her needs downward to preserve calm, how rarely Cassian had met her halfway once success demanded more of him. These realizations did not arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, each one reinforcing the last. Clarity replaced confusion. Eloin saw that her hurt was not only about betrayal. It was about imbalance that had been allowed to deepen unchecked. The affair had not created the distance, it had exposed it. And exposure, once complete, could not be undone. She stopped asking herself how to fix what had broken. The question no longer applied. Repair requires mutual effort. What she now saw clearly was that she had been working alone for a long time, maintaining something that no longer responded to her care. This realization was sobering, not dramatic. It stripped the situation of fantasy. There would be no return to an earlier version of them. Not because she was unwilling, but because clarity does not retreat once it arrives. Eloin did not feel empowered in the way stories often describe. She felt grounded, anchored in truth rather than hope. Hurt had sharpened her perception instead of blinding it. And in that clarity, she understood something essential. Saving the marriage had become a solitary effort. She no longer carried the responsibility to continue it alone. There was no single event that marked the moment Eloin stopped trying to save the marriage by herself. It was not a conversation, not a decision spoken aloud, not a final disappointment that forced her hand. It happened quietly, through accumulation, through the steady realization. That effort without response eventually becomes self-abandonment. She noticed it in her own behavior first. She no longer anticipated Cassian's moods, no longer adjusted her schedule to accommodate his availability, no longer shaped her emotional responses to preserve ease. These were not acts of withdrawal, but of correction. She was reclaiming energy she had spent managing an imbalance that was never acknowledged. Eloin understood then that love cannot survive on endurance alone. Commitment requires participation, and what she had been offering, patience, understanding, flexibility, had not been met with reciprocity for a long time. She had been protecting something that was no longer being held with her. This realization did not harden her. It clarified her boundaries. She stopped rehearsing conversations that would never change outcomes, stopped imagining explanations that might soften truth, stopped hoping for recognition that had already been withheld. The responsibility she had carried so faithfully slipped from her shoulders, not because she dropped it, but because she finally saw it was never meant to be hers alone. Stillness became resolution. She moved through her days calmly, but with a different center. She was no longer waiting for Cassian to notice the distance or correct it. She was no longer invested in preserving appearances. What mattered now was accuracy, seeing the situation as it was, not as it had once been. And in that accuracy, Eloin felt something unfamiliar: relief. Not relief from pain, but relief from effort that no longer served her. From trying to hold together something already divided. From carrying a future that required two people when only one remained engaged. If you've ever stayed quiet in a situation, not because you were weak, but because you were thinking, if you've ever chosen restraint over reaction, ask yourself this: was your silence misunderstood? Was it absence? Or was it strategy? Let us know in the comments. Eloin's advantage did not come from brilliance revealed overnight. It came from familiarity earned over years of proximity. Long before Cassian's success became something others admired from a distance, she had lived inside the mechanics that sustained it. She understood not just what he owned, but how ownership was structured, moved, and protected. Cassian often spoke about his work in broad terms when addressing the public: growth, expansion, performance. Those words were designed for consumption. At home, the language changed. Discussions became technical. Decisions were dissected in detail. Eloin listened closely, not because she needed to intervene, but because she had always been present when choices were made. She knew which assets were designed to be visible and which were not, which ventures were held directly and which were positioned elsewhere, which accounts were meant for transparency and which existed to manage complexity quietly. None of this information had been hidden from her intentionally. Cassian simply assumed familiarity would never turn into scrutiny. Spouses see what outsiders don't, because they live where performance ends. Eloin had heard Cassian speak freely about risk, exposure, and protection. She had seen how money shifted in response to pressure. She had witnessed the measures taken to separate responsibility from accountability. Over time, she learned which structures were solid and which relied heavily on trust remaining unquestioned. This knowledge did not make her powerful in the way Cassian was powerful. It made her precise. She understood the rhythm of his finances, when movements were routine and when they were deliberate. She recognized patterns that appeared stable but required careful alignment to maintain. What looked seamless from the outside depended on order being preserved internally. Eloin had never needed this information before. She had absorbed it passively without intention. Now, with clarity sharpened and emotion set aside, she began to see its relevance differently, not as leverage, but as context, not as ammunition, but as understanding. Cassian believed control lived in scale, in reach, in influence, in visibility. Eloin understood control lived in structure, in knowing how things fit together, in recognizing where precision mattered more than force. She had not studied his empire to challenge it. She had simply lived inside it long enough to know where it held. From the outside, Cassian's success appeared effortless. Growth followed announcement. Expansion followed confidence. To observers, the empire seemed self-sustaining, driven by vision and reinforced by influence. What no one saw was how much of that appearance depended on quiet maintenance. Eloin saw it because she lived alongside it. She witnessed the gaps between public narrative and private reality, the moments where confidence masked contingency, the nights when Cassian recalculated risk aloud, pacing through rooms he believed were safe from consequence. She heard which partnerships required careful handling and which ones could withstand pressure. She knew where margins were generous and where precision was non-negotiable. Outsiders encountered results. Eloin encountered process. She knew how quickly structures shifted in response to threat, how safeguards were adjusted when exposure increased, how certain decisions were made not to grow but to protect. This information was never shared formally. It existed in conversation, in habit, in repetition. It accumulated naturally over time. This was the advantage no consultant, investor, or rival could replicate. Eloin understood not only how Cassian's world functioned, but why certain choices had been made in the first place. She knew which assets carried emotional attachment, and which ones existed purely for strategy. She knew which ventures Cassian watched closely, and which he assumed would remain undisturbed. Most importantly, she understood how much of the empire relied on assumption. Assumption that trust remained intact. Assumption that proximity would never become analysis. Assumption that familiarity would not sharpen into attention. Eloin had been present during moments of vulnerability others never witnessed. Times when Cassian questioned his own decisions, when outcomes hung in balance, when success felt less certain than it appeared. These moments revealed more than any report ever could. She did not need access beyond what she already had. She did not need permission to understand what had always been discussed openly at home. What she possessed was not secret knowledge. It was contextual knowledge, the kind that reveals where strength ends and dependence begins. And in recognizing that difference, Eloin understood something essential. Empires are not maintained by dominance alone. They are maintained by coherence, by systems working as expected. She knew exactly which expectations Cassian relied on, and which ones, once questioned, would matter most. Cassian's public image was built on clarity. Numbers moved upward. Projects launched on schedule. Decisions appeared decisive and clean. To the outside world, success looked linear, almost inevitable. What few understood was how much effort went into keeping that appearance intact. Eloin understood because she had seen the contrast firsthand. Behind every announcement was negotiation. Behind every milestone was adjustment. The empire did not operate as a single solid entity. It functioned as a network of interdependent parts, each requiring alignment to maintain balance. When one element shifted, others had to compensate quietly. Cassian spoke openly at home about these pressures. He discussed exposure in measured terms, not as fear, but as calculation. He explained how public confidence depended on private coordination, how complexity, if mishandled, could invite scrutiny he preferred to avoid. Eloin listened, not as an auditor, but as a partner who understood the stakes. She saw how success demanded compartmentalization, how responsibilities were separated to reduce risk, how visibility was managed carefully to preserve control. These strategies worked because they were consistent, because they assumed stability within the structure itself. But complexity carries its own fragility. Eloin recognized that what appeared seamless depended heavily on timing, documentation, and continuity. The system was strong when treated precisely. It became vulnerable when assumptions were challenged. What protected Cassian publicly was not invincibility, it was order. This distinction mattered. Outsiders saw wealth as a shield. Eloin saw it as a system that required maintenance. She knew which areas could withstand attention, and which ones depended on remaining unexamined. She understood that complexity does not fail loudly. It fails when alignment breaks. Her insight was not rooted in opposition. It came from intimacy with the inner workings of a life built on scale. She had observed how quickly Cassian moved to stabilize situations when risk appeared, how carefully he guarded certain processes, how much he relied on predictability remaining intact. Eloin did not need to imagine how exposure could occur. She had heard him explain it himself. This understanding reframed everything she was preparing to do. The empire's strength lay not in its size, but in the belief that its internal logic would never be questioned by the person closest to it. That belief had been safe for a long time. It was no longer guaranteed. Eloin did not rush once she understood what she held. Knowledge alone was not action. It required discipline, patience, and restraint. Acting too quickly would announce awareness before readiness. Acting emotionally would invite resistance. Eloin understood that preparation worked best when it remained invisible. She began organizing information quietly, not obsessively, not impulsively. She returned to records she had always managed and viewed them differently now, through the lens of sequence and alignment. She noted where timelines intersected, where structures overlapped, where clarity depended on documentation being read together rather than separately. Every step she took remained within boundaries. She did not fabricate. She did not speculate. She did not reach for anything that did not already belong within her responsibility. What she gathered was factual, orderly, and defensible. Precision mattered more than volume. Eloin understood the difference between suspicion and preparation. One invites dismissal. The other withstands scrutiny. She chose the latter. She also understood that strategy required time. Allowing patterns to continue revealed consistency. Allowing assumptions to remain intact preserved access. Cassian remained unaware, confident that the stability he relied on was unquestioned. Eloin allowed this confidence to stand. Her preparation was not driven by vengeance. It was driven by accuracy. She knew legal processes favored clarity over emotion. That documentation spoke louder than explanation. That restraint preserved credibility. Eloin shaped her actions accordingly, moving deliberately, never drawing attention to the shift already underway. What made her preparation effective was not secrecy, it was normalcy. Nothing about her behavior changed externally. She attended events. She maintained routines. She remained composed. Inside, however, she was assembling understanding into structure. The tension lay not in whether she was ready. It lay in how completely she had been underestimated. Cassian believed power protected him from consequence. Eloin understood that preparation, when paired with patience, carried its own authority. She was not positioning herself to attack his empire. She was positioning herself to allow it to be seen clearly. And once that happened, control would no longer belong solely to the person who assumed silence meant ignorance. For a long time, Eloin's sense of self had existed in proximity to Cassian's life rather than independently from it. Her days were shaped around shared routines, shared obligations, shared direction. Even her private thoughts often referenced the marriage first, how decisions would affect it, how choices might disrupt it, how silence might preserve it. When she stopped carrying the relationship alone, something unfamiliar emerged: space. At first, the space felt unsettling. Without the constant mental labor of maintaining balance, Eloin noticed how much of her inner world had been organized around accommodation. She had not disappeared, but she had narrowed herself carefully, adjusting her edges to fit alongside Cassian's expanding presence. Now, with clarity anchoring her, she began to notice what remained when that adjustment stopped. She returned to interests she had once postponed rather than abandoned. Activities she had set aside because they required time, attention, or emotional energy she had redirected elsewhere. She did not rush back into them with intensity. She approached them gently, allowing herself to explore without expectation. Eloin also began paying attention to her own reactions again. She noticed what brought her calm rather than tension. What conversations felt restorative rather than draining. What environments allowed her to breathe without monitoring herself. These observations mattered. They reminded her that identity is not something granted by partnership. It exists independently of it. This rediscovery did not arrive with dramatic reinvention. It arrived through small choices. Choosing not to explain herself when explanation wasn't required. Choosing to spend time alone without framing it as absence. Choosing to honor her preferences without negotiation. Eloin realized then that much of who she was had remained intact, simply unattended. Her values, her curiosity, her emotional depth, none of these had vanished. They had been redirected, waiting for space to re-emerge. The most grounding realization was this: she did not need to rebuild herself. She needed to return to herself. And in that return, Eloin felt the beginnings of something steady, not excitement, not relief, but recognition. A quiet awareness that her identity had never depended on being chosen by someone else. It had only required her attention. As Eloin's attention shifted inward, her relationships began to change quietly as well. Not dramatically, not through announcements or explanations, but through presence that no longer felt depleted by obligation. She reached out to people she had not fully let go of, but had gradually drifted from, as her world narrowed around the marriage. These friendships did not demand performance. They did not require her to maintain balance or soften truth. Conversations unfolded without calculation. She spoke freely, listened fully, and felt something she had not felt in a long time: ease. Not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer editing herself to preserve harmony. With friends, Elowen noticed how differently she showed up. She laughed without restraint. She spoke without filtering for consequence. She allowed herself to be supported without immediately redirecting attention back to someone else's needs. This felt unfamiliar at first, almost indulgent. Then it felt necessary. Through these interactions, Elowen began to rebuild her sense of self-respect, not as a concept, but as a practice. She stopped apologizing for her presence. She stopped shrinking her thoughts to fit into conversations. She recognized how often she had been accommodating at the cost of her own expression. Healing did not come from analysis alone. It came from connection that did not require endurance, from being received without effort, from realizing that support could exist without strings attached. Elowen also learned to sit with herself more comfortably. She spent time alone without distraction, allowing thoughts to settle rather than managing them. In that stillness, she acknowledged grief without rushing to resolve it. She did not label herself as broken. She allowed emotion to exist without assigning it urgency. What surprised her most was how little explanation these shifts required. No one demanded justification. No one questioned her boundaries. The resistance she had anticipated never arrived. This reinforced an important truth: self-respect does not announce itself. It is felt through consistency. Elowen was no longer measuring her worth through sacrifice. She was no longer proving loyalty through silence. The relationships she nurtured now met her where she stood, rather than where she had been willing to shrink herself. And in those connections, quiet, reciprocal, grounding, she began to heal without needing permission. The final shift did not come from anger or disappointment. It came from understanding. Elowen began to see how deeply she had confused endurance with commitment. For years she had believed that staying quiet, staying flexible, and staying present, no matter the cost, was proof of love. She had treated emotional discomfort as something to be managed privately rather than addressed openly. Strength, she believed, meant holding things together even when doing so required silence. This belief had guided many of her choices. She had waited instead of asking, adjusted instead of insisting, accepted distance instead of questioning its permanence. None of these decisions felt wrong at the time. They felt responsible, mature, loyal. But with clarity now firmly in place, Elowen could see what endurance had actually done. It had shifted the balance of the relationship without restoring it. Love, she realized, does not require one person to carry the weight alone. Endurance can preserve routine, but it cannot preserve connection. What she had sustained was not intimacy, but structure. The marriage had continued to exist because she made space for it to do so, even when reciprocity faded. That effort had been invisible, unacknowledged, and ultimately unsustainable. This realization did not invalidate her past. It reframed it. Elowen did not regret the patience she had offered. She understood now that it came from generosity, not weakness. But generosity without mutual care becomes depletion. And depletion, left unaddressed, erodes even the most sincere intentions. She recognized how often she had silenced her needs to maintain calm, how rarely she had allowed herself to expect engagement in return. This pattern had not protected love. It had allowed imbalance to settle comfortably. With this understanding came a quiet release. Elowen no longer felt obligated to prove her devotion through endurance. She no longer believed love required self-denial to survive. Commitment, she understood, is expressed through presence, participation, and shared responsibility, not quiet suffering. This insight did not harden her. It steadied her. She moved forward without resentment, but also without illusion. The version of love she now recognized left room for voice, for reciprocity, for rest. It did not ask her to disappear in order to remain. And in learning this, Elowen completed a cycle she had been moving through for a long time, one that brought her back to herself, not as someone recovering, but as someone finally aligned with her own worth. Cassian chose his moment carefully. He didn't raise his voice or frame the announcement as conflict. He spoke as though he was sharing a conclusion already reached, not initiating a process that required dialogue. His tone was measured, calm, almost considerate. The words were delivered with the ease of someone who believed the difficult part had already been handled internally. He spoke about timing, about practicality, about how this was the most reasonable path forward. There was no apology woven into the explanation, no visible discomfort. Cassian presented the decision as inevitable rather than debatable, as though the marriage had simply reached its logical endpoint. What stood out most was his certainty. He spoke with the confidence of a man accustomed to outcomes aligning with expectation. He referenced fairness without inviting discussion. He assumed cooperation without seeking consent. The structure of his announcement left little room for resistance, because he did not believe resistance would occur. Cassian had already decided how this would unfold. He believed Elowen would be overwhelmed by the scale of the process. That complexity would encourage compromise. That his familiarity with systems, advisors, and leverage would naturally position him ahead. He did not view this as advantage. He viewed it as reality. This was not arrogance in the obvious sense. It was assumption shaped by years of control working exactly as intended. Cassian spoke as though he were managing transition, not ending partnership. His confidence rested on the belief that power determined outcome, and power, in his mind, had always favored him. What he did not consider was preparation that existed outside his awareness. He did not account for clarity that had already been reached. He did not imagine that Elowen had moved beyond reaction. As he spoke, Cassian believed he was setting terms. In truth, he was revealing how much he had underestimated the woman sitting across from him. Cassian spoke as though the next steps were already mapped out. He referenced advisors, processes, timelines, elements meant to convey inevitability rather than invite participation. The details were presented efficiently, almost generously, as if he were offering Elowen a clear path through something she would otherwise struggle to navigate. His expectation of control was subtle but absolute. He assumed familiarity with the system would translate into advantage. That experience, navigating complexity, would discourage challenge. That access to resources would make resistance impractical. Cassian did not threaten. He did not need to. The structure of his explanation carried its own message. This was not a level field. He spoke of division as though it were administrative. Assets were mentioned in broad categories, without specificity. Responsibility was framed as protection. The tone suggested that cooperation would be rewarded with ease, while complication would invite difficulty. Cassian believed this logic was persuasive rather than coercive. What he failed to recognize was how transparent his assumptions had become. He did not ask what Elowen wanted. He did not check whether she agreed. He operated from the belief that agreement would follow naturally, shaped by imbalance. Control, in his experience, had always softened opposition before it could form. Cassian believed he was being reasonable. He believed Elowen would respond with concern, hesitation, perhaps even relief. That she would defer to his understanding of what was fair. That she would trust him to manage the outcome in a way that minimized disruption, for both of them, but especially for her. This confidence did not come from cruelty. It came from habit. From years of outcomes aligning with expectation, from systems responding predictably to influence. Cassian did not consider the possibility that Elowen had already assessed those systems from within, that she had prepared without signaling resistance. That control, once assumed, is most vulnerable when it goes unquestioned for too long. As he spoke, Cassian believed he was leading the moment. He did not realize how thoroughly he had misread it. Elowen listened without interruption. She did not stiffen. She did not question his phrasing or challenge his assumptions. Her expression remained steady, her posture unchanged. To Cassian, this composure confirmed everything he believed. Calm, he assumed, meant agreement. Silence, he assumed, meant acceptance. He mistook her restraint for uncertainty. Elowen responded only when he finished speaking, and even then, her words were few. She acknowledged what he had said without endorsing it. She asked no questions. She offered no emotional reaction. There was no visible distress for him to manage, no hesitation for him to address. This unsettled him slightly, though he did not name it. Cassian had expected emotion. Confusion, perhaps. Concern about process. Questions about security. Eloin's steadiness did not fit the response he had rehearsed for. Still, he interpreted it as passivity rather than preparation. He believed her calm signaled trust, that she would rely on him to guide the process forward, that she was overwhelmed enough to defer rather than resist. He did not consider that composure could exist without dependency. Eloin, for her part, understood exactly how her stillness would be read. She had lived long enough inside Cassian's expectations to anticipate the conclusion he would draw. She allowed that conclusion to stand. She did not clarify. She did not correct. Her response was not strategic in the theatrical sense. It was accurate. She had nothing to reveal yet, nothing to contest in that moment. The time for reaction had passed long before this conversation began. As Cassian spoke again, offering reassurance he believed was necessary, Eloin recognized the full shape of the imbalance he assumed was inevitable, and she understood something essential. The more composed she remained, the more confident he became, and that confidence would make everything that followed possible. Cassian left the conversation convinced the outcome was already decided. In his mind, the imbalance was not something to be questioned, it was something to be managed. He believed his familiarity with legal structures, financial complexity, and procedural rhythm would naturally place him ahead. Eloin's lack of visible resistance reinforced that belief. To him, the path forward appeared orderly, predictable, and firmly within his control. He assumed disparity would do the work for him. Cassian expected the scale of the process to intimidate. He expected the weight of documentation, counsel, and timelines to discourage challenge. He believed Eloin would prioritize stability over assertion, ease over contest. That belief was not rooted in malice. It was rooted in precedent. He had watched imbalance resolve conflicts before, quietly, efficiently, without consequence. What he failed to account for was preparation that did not announce itself. He believed power existed only in visibility, in access, in authority, in command. He did not recognize that Eloin had already repositioned herself outside that framework. She was no longer reacting to imbalance. She was measuring it. As Cassian moved forward, confident and unguarded, Eloin observed how easily certainty replaced caution. She noted what he revealed through assumption, how much he relied on her remaining exactly as he perceived her to be. He believed inevitability was on his side. Eloin understood inevitability only exists when it goes unexamined. She did not challenge him then. She did not disrupt the moment he believed belonged to him. She allowed his certainty to remain intact, because certainty, once settled, encourages exposure. Cassian walked away believing the marriage had ended on his terms. Eloin stayed behind understanding that what he assumed was imbalance was, in fact, opportunity. And the moment he stopped being careful was the moment he unknowingly made room for consequence. Cassian arrived in court as he entered most professional spaces, with certainty. His legal team moved ahead of him, confident and coordinated, their presence designed to communicate readiness before a single word was spoken. Their files were stacked neatly, their expressions composed, their posture relaxed. This was familiar ground for them. They had prepared for resistance, negotiation, and emotional volatility. What they did not prepare for was restraint. Eloin entered without spectacle, no entourage, no visible urgency. She took her seat quietly, arranging her documents with care, her attention focused forward. There was no attempt to project dominance or urgency. She did not match Cassian's confidence, nor did she oppose it. She allowed it to exist unchallenged. The contrast was striking. Cassian's team spoke early, framing the narrative with authority. They outlined timelines, referenced complexity, and emphasized the scale of what was at stake. Their language suggested inevitability, an outcome shaped by experience and advantage. They spoke as though the facts were already aligned in their favor. Eloin listened. She did not interrupt. She did not object prematurely. She allowed assumptions to surface fully, understanding that clarity requires space to reveal itself. Her stillness was not passive, it was selective. She waited for the right moment, not the loudest one. When her counsel began, the shift was subtle. The tone was measured. The approach was deliberate. No accusations were made without grounding. No claims were introduced without sequence. Each point was positioned carefully, not to overwhelm, but to align. Documents were introduced gradually, each one placed with purpose. Dates were connected. Records were cross-referenced. What had been presented as isolated details began to form a structure that demanded attention. The court's focus shifted, not abruptly, but steadily. Cassian remained composed at first. He listened with the same confidence he had brought into the room. But as the methodical progression continued, something changed. His attention sharpened, his posture adjusted. The ease he had relied on began to tighten. Eloin did not look at him. She remained focused on process, allowing truth to establish itself without commentary. The power in the room began to move, not through volume or force, but through precision. And for the first time since the proceedings began, Cassian realized this was not a negotiation shaped by dominance. It was an examination shaped by accuracy. As the proceedings continued, the focus shifted from narrative to structure. Eloin's counsel did not rush. Each piece of evidence was introduced in sequence, allowing context to settle before connection was drawn. What emerged was not accusation, but coherence. Financial records were presented first. They were not framed as scandal, but as data. Transfers were displayed alongside dates. Accounts were identified by purpose rather than implication. On their own, the documents appeared technical. Together, they formed a pattern that resisted dismissal. Movements aligned too closely to be accidental. Timelines overlapped in ways that contradicted earlier explanations. The court listened. Cassian's legal team responded with confidence at first, offering alternative interpretations and emphasizing complexity. They spoke about structure, about industry norms, about the necessity of layered systems at scale. Their tone suggested that what appeared irregular was simply misunderstood. Then the timelines were placed side by side. Trips once described broadly were matched to transactions with precision. Gaps in reporting appeared where clarity should have existed. Accounts introduced as independent were shown to move in relation to one another. Each clarification tightened the framework rather than loosening it. Eloin remained still as this unfolded. She did not react to each revelation. She did not look for validation in the room. Her focus remained fixed on the process she had trusted to carry the weight of truth. She had prepared for this moment, not emotionally, but structurally. Cassian began to shift. He leaned forward slightly as explanations required adjustment. His legal team consulted more frequently, voices lowered, notes exchanged. The pace of their responses slowed as they recalibrated in real time. Confidence gave way to calculation. What made the evidence effective was not volume. It was alignment. Each record reinforced the last. Each clarification removed space for reinterpretation. The system Cassian had relied on for insulation now required justification. The court did not react dramatically. There were no visible gestures of shock or surprise. Attention simply narrowed. Questions became more precise. The atmosphere changed, not through intensity, but through focus. Truth, when introduced methodically, does not demand reaction. It commands consideration, and with each document placed into context, Cassian's certainty began to require explanation rather than assumption. As the evidence accumulated, the tone of the proceedings shifted in a way Cassian had not anticipated. What had once felt manageable now required careful navigation. Each response demanded precision. Each explanation needed to align not only with the present moment, but with what had already been established. Contradictions surfaced quietly. Statements made earlier in the process began to narrow under scrutiny. Dates that had been described as approximate were now required to be exact. Accounts presented as independent were shown to interact in ways that challenged that framing. Clarifications offered by Cassian's team invited follow-up questions that tightened rather than relieved pressure. Cassian remained composed, but the ease he had entered with was no longer available to him. He adjusted his posture repeatedly, attention shifting between his counsel and the documents now under examination. Each new clarification required recalibration. Each attempt to contextualize introduced additional detail that had to be reconciled. The narrative he had relied on began to feel less stable as it expanded. Eloin watched without reaction. She did not lean forward. She did not track each exchange with visible interest. Her stillness remained intact, not as detachment, but as trust in the structure she had prepared. She understood that truth did not require reinforcement once established. Cassian's legal team worked diligently, reframing explanations with professionalism and restraint, but their language changed. Certainty softened into possibility. Statements, once delivered confidently, were now qualified. The pace slowed as alignment became more difficult to maintain. What made this moment pivotal was not exposure, it was inconsistency. The court's attention sharpened where explanations diverged. Questions followed naturally, not as challenge, but as necessity. Each inquiry reduced the space available for reinterpretation. The system Cassian had depended on to smooth complexity now demanded clarity instead. Cassian did not speak out of turn. He did not raise his voice. He did not lose composure. Yet the strain was visible in the way his attention stayed fixed on details he had never expected to defend so closely. This was not confrontation. It was examination, and examination, once engaged, does not move backward. As contradictions settled into the record, Cassian understood something he had not prepared for. Power does not dissolve when challenged loudly. It dissolves when it must explain itself repeatedly, and cannot. The moment Cassian lost ground did not arrive with spectacle. There was no raised voice, no dramatic interruption, no outward display of defeat. What changed was quieter and far more decisive. The court's questions began to narrow. They no longer asked whether something had occurred, but how and why. Explanations that once rested on general practice were now required to account for specific movements. Each answer had to align precisely with what was already on record. The margin for flexibility disappeared. Cassian felt this shift before he fully understood it. His counsel paused more often, recalculating responses that no longer landed with the confidence they once carried. Clarifications required careful phrasing. Assumptions that had previously held were now examined rather than accepted. The authority Cassian had relied on no longer shaped the room. Eloin remained unchanged. She did not respond to each development with expression or commentary. Her focus stayed fixed on process rather than outcome. She had anticipated this phase, not in detail, but in principle. Preparation had taught her that once alignment breaks, control becomes difficult to recover. The court's attention settled fully on the structure now visible. Accounts connected where separation had been claimed. Timelines matched too closely to dismiss. The complexity Cassian had once trusted to shield him now demanded explanation at every point. What unraveled him was not accusation. It was repetition. Each explanation required reinforcement. Each reinforcement introduced another layer that had to be reconciled. The weight of consistency grew heavier with every attempt to maintain it. Cassian's confidence thinned, not outwardly but internally, as certainty gave way to calculation. He did not protest. He did not object unnecessarily. But the belief that power alone would carry him through had quietly expired. This was the moment the audience understands what Cassian does not want to admit. Truth, when placed patiently and without urgency, does not need force to prevail. If stories like this, where preparation matters more than noise, and clarity outlasts dominance, resonate with you, support Midnight Story Vault by liking and sharing. These stories reach further when they're passed on. Cassian arrived, expecting advantage. Eloin arrived, prepared for examination. And when power met truth, only one of them was built to withstand it. The shift began with a single question, one that appeared simple on the surface, yet carried weight Cassian had not anticipated. It was not asked loudly. It was not framed as accusation. It was delivered calmly, almost routinely, as part of the court's effort to clarify what had already been placed on record. The question referenced a specific transaction, a defined period, and a stated purpose that Cassian himself had previously described. All that was required was consistency. Cassian paused, not for long, but long enough to be noticed. His attention moved quickly to his counsel, then back again, as though searching for confirmation that this question belonged to a different sequence. But it didn't. It sat squarely within the structure he had helped outline earlier. He began to answer, then stopped. The explanation he reached for depended on assumptions already weakened. Any response he offered would either contradict earlier statements or require introducing new details that demanded verification. The simplicity of the question left no room for reframing. It required a direct alignment between intent, timing, and documentation. Cassian had none that could stand alone. The court waited. This was not a dramatic pause. It was procedural, necessary, and, in that stillness, the imbalance he had relied on quietly dissolved. The system no longer moved in his favor. It simply waited for clarity. Eloin did not look at him. She remained composed, her focus unchanged, understanding that this moment did not belong to reaction. It belonged to exposure through absence, the absence of an answer that could hold. Cassian eventually responded, but the certainty was gone. The question had already done its work. The pause that followed was brief, but it altered everything. It was not filled with tension or noise. No one shifted abruptly. No one interrupted. Yet the atmosphere changed in a way that could not be reversed. The court's attention sharpened, settling fully on the absence that had just appeared, an absence of clarity where confidence had once lived. Cassian felt it immediately. The momentum he had relied on stalled. The rhythm of the proceedings, once familiar and predictable, slowed to accommodate scrutiny. This pause was not about delay. It was about recognition. Recognition that something essential had failed to align. His counsel attempted to steady the moment, offering clarification that circled the issue rather than resolving it. The words were careful, measured, professional, but they did not restore coherence. Each attempt to explain required further explanation, extending the pause rather than closing it. The court did not react outwardly. It simply waited. That waiting mattered. It shifted authority away from assertion and toward verification. It signaled that explanation alone would no longer suffice. What had been accepted earlier as reasonable now required confirmation grounded in record. Eloin remained still throughout. She did not lean forward. She did not track the exchange with visible interest. Her posture reflected understanding rather than anticipation. She knew this pause was not dramatic but decisive. Once a system pauses to reassess, it does not return to assumption. Cassian sensed control slipping, not through confrontation but through recalibration. The court was no longer following his lead. It was examining the structure he had trusted to carry him forward. In that quiet pause, power did not announce its transfer. It simply moved. What followed was not an announcement. There was no declaration that authority had shifted, no moment where anyone acknowledged it openly. Yet, everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had changed. Power no longer rested with the person who spoke most confidently. It rested with the record. From that point forward, Cassian was no longer guiding the direction of the proceedings. He was responding to them. Each question that followed was narrower, more precise, less willing to accommodate assumption. The system that had once responded to his certainty now required him to meet its demands on its terms. Eloin recognized the change immediately. She did not adjust her posture or expression. She did not acknowledge the shift outwardly. But she understood that the work she had done quietly, without urgency, without announcement, had reached its conclusion. Preparation had given way to consequence. Cassian's responses became increasingly careful. Each word was weighed, each explanation measured. The confidence that once carried him forward had been replaced by calculation. He was no longer operating from advantage. He was navigating constraint. The court moved steadily, not aggressively. There was no need for escalation. The absence of clarity had already established a new balance. Authority now belonged to verification rather than assumption. Eloin remained where she had always been, composed, attentive, resolved. She had not raised her voice. She had not confronted him publicly. She had not demanded recognition, yet power had transferred all the same. This was the reversal Cassian had never prepared for, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. When the proceedings continued, they did so under a different logic, one shaped by accuracy rather than influence. Cassian was no longer directing the outcome. He was responding to it, and Eloin, without a single visible gesture, had become the still point around which everything now turned. When the ruling came, it was delivered without flourish. There was no emphasis on fault, no language designed to humiliate or punish. The court did not frame its decision as a victory for one side or a defeat for the other. Instead, it spoke in terms of structure, contribution, and alignment, words that reflected assessment rather than emotion. What was acknowledged was not betrayal alone, but reality. The ruling recognized patterns that had been demonstrated clearly and patiently. It acknowledged responsibility where it existed and contribution where it had long gone. Unnamed, the decision did not attempt to rebalance the marriage emotionally. It addressed what could be addressed, fairness grounded in record. Eloin listened without reaction. She did not smile. She did not exhale in relief. The ruling did not feel like triumph to her. It felt like accuracy, like the end of distortion, like something long misrepresented had finally been seen clearly. The court did not describe Eloin as a victim. It did not elevate her through sympathy. Instead, it acknowledged her role through evidence, her involvement, her awareness, her presence within the structure that had been examined. This mattered. Eloin had not come seeking revenge. She had not asked the court to punish Cassian. She had asked for recognition grounded in truth. And that was exactly what the ruling provided. The language used was measured, deliberate, restrained. It avoided spectacle. It avoided excess. It affirmed balance rather than dramatizing consequence. In that moment, justice was not loud. It was precise. And for Eloin, precision was enough. Eloin was not positioned as a winner in the way people often expect courtroom stories to end. There was no moment where her name was elevated above Cassian's, no framing that cast her as having outplayed him. The ruling did not reward cleverness or strategy. It recognized contribution. That distinction mattered deeply. For years, Eloin's role had existed quietly, present, essential, and largely unnamed. The court did not exaggerate it. It did not romanticize it. It simply placed it where it belonged within the record. Her involvement was treated as factual, not symbolic. Her awareness was treated as legitimate, not incidental. This recognition did not feel like vindication. It felt like correction. Eloin understood then that justice does not always arrive as reversal. Sometimes it arrives as alignment, bringing things back into proportion after years of quiet imbalance. What had been minimized was now accounted for. What had been assumed away was now acknowledged. She remained composed as the details were outlined. There was no impulse to celebrate, no desire to look across the room for reaction. Eloin had not sought this moment for validation. She had sought it for clarity, and clarity, once established, required no further display. The ruling affirmed that her presence within the marriage had been substantive, that her familiarity with the shared structure was not incidental, that the contributions she had made did not dissolve simply because visibility had shifted elsewhere. In recognizing her without spectacle, the court restored something that had been eroded gradually: legitimacy. Eloin did not leave feeling elevated. She left feeling seen. And in that acknowledgement, quiet, thorough, and grounded, there was a sense of balance returning to a story that had long leaned in only one direction. Cassian received the ruling without outward protest. He did not object loudly or attempt to reclaim authority through display. He remained seated, composed, listening as the outcome settled into finality. What he lost in that moment was not respect, but command. The system no longer responded to his expectations alone. The court did not strip him of dignity. It did not frame him as a villain or diminish the work he had built. His achievements were not erased. His standing was not ridiculed. What changed was his position within the process. Control, once assumed, was now shared with consequence. Cassian understood this immediately. The ruling did not shame him. It corrected the imbalance he believed would protect him. The authority he had relied on was no longer unilateral. It had been redistributed through structure, not force. Elowyn noticed this distinction as well. She did not take satisfaction in his loss of control. There was no desire to watch him struggle or react. This was not about reversal for its own sake. It was about restoration of proportion. What had tilted too far in one direction had been brought back into alignment. Cassian's composure remained intact, but the certainty beneath it was gone. He no longer directed the outcome. He responded to it. That shift carried consequence without cruelty. The court closed the matter with professionalism, signaling completion rather than triumph. The process ended not with humiliation, but with resolution. In that resolution, something important was preserved. Cassian left with his dignity intact, but without the unchecked authority he once assumed. Elowyn left without spectacle, but with recognition that could not be withdrawn. Justice, in this moment, did not demand collapse. It required balance. When the process ended, Elowyn did not linger. There were no statements offered, no clarifications made to satisfy curiosity. She declined interviews, avoided commentary, and resisted the quiet pressure to explain herself publicly. The outcome had been recorded where it mattered. She had no desire to extend the story beyond its proper conclusion. For Elowyn, peace required containment. She understood how easily resolution could be diluted by performance, how quickly attention could turn something private into spectacle. She had spent too many years being interpreted through someone else's narrative to invite further reinterpretation now. She chose discretion. Elowyn stepped away without dramatizing departure. She did not attempt to correct assumptions or reclaim reputation through visibility. Those who needed to know already did. Those who did not were not owed explanation. This decision was not avoidance. It was clarity. She recognized that public validation would not deepen her healing. That recognition, already achieved through structure, did not require reinforcement through opinion. The court had done its work. Her role now was to move forward without carrying the weight of proving anything further. Cassian's world continued visibly. Conversations followed. Interpretations circulated. Elowyn allowed all of it to exist without participation. She no longer measured her peace against external response. Walking away quietly felt intentional. It allowed the story to end, without echo, without distortion, without lingering attachment to a chapter that had already closed. For the first time in a long while, Elowyn's decisions were guided not by preservation or endurance, but by alignment with her own well-being. She did not need the world to see her strength. She needed to live it. Healing did not arrive for Elowyn as a clean break or a sudden sense of relief. It unfolded gradually, without markers or milestones to announce progress. She did not expect herself to feel complete simply because the process had concluded. Resolution on record did not erase years of adjustment, restraint, or emotional labor, so she allowed healing to move at its own pace. Some days felt lighter. Others carried weight she could not immediately explain. Elowyn learned to accept both without judgment. She no longer rushed herself toward optimism or closure. She understood that recovery was not a task to be completed, but a state to be rebuilt slowly through consistency. She focused on structure rather than outcome. Her days became simpler, not because life had narrowed, but because she no longer filled it with unnecessary effort. She re-established routines that felt grounding rather than demanding. She chose environments that offered steadiness rather than stimulation. Healing, she realized, required safety more than excitement. Elowyn also learned to be patient with memory. Certain moments resurfaced unexpectedly, not to reopen wounds, but to be reprocessed with new understanding. She revisited these memories without self-blame, recognizing how much of her past behavior had been shaped by generosity rather than weakness. What changed most was her relationship with herself. She stopped questioning whether she had waited too long or endured too much. Those questions no longer served her. She replaced them with gentler ones. What feels steady? What feels honest? What feels restorative? Healing, she discovered, did not mean forgetting. It meant integrating experience without allowing it to define her future. It meant moving forward with clarity rather than urgency, with acceptance rather than resistance. Eloin did not measure progress by how little she felt. She measured it by how much she trusted herself again. When love returned to Eloin's life, it did not arrive with urgency or intensity. It came quietly, without promises or persuasion. There was no attempt to impress, no effort to accelerate closeness. What drew her in was not momentum, but steadiness. This love felt different from what she had known before. It did not require endurance. It did not test her patience or ask her to interpret silence. It showed up through presence, through consistency that did not need explanation. Conversations felt mutual rather than managed. Affection was offered without performance. Space existed without distance. Eloin noticed how little effort it took to remain herself. She did not shrink her thoughts or soften her needs. She did not anticipate disappointment or prepare for imbalance. What she felt was safety, not as comfort alone, but as permission to exist fully without negotiation. This did not mean she forgot the past. She carried her experience with awareness, not caution. She understood now how easily intensity could disguise imbalance. She paid attention to reciprocity, to how care was offered and received. Love, she realized, should not feel like work done alone. What surprised her most was how unremarkable this return felt. There were no declarations or dramatic turning points, just a gradual recognition that connection could exist without cost to her identity. That partnership could feel collaborative rather than consuming. Eloin did not define this love as a reward for endurance. She saw it as alignment, two people meeting without expectation of sacrifice. Love that did not demand disappearance. Love that allowed her to remain whole. And in that wholeness, Eloin understood something clearly at last. The sweetest outcome was not revenge. It was not victory. It was walking forward without having to leave herself behind. Betrayal rarely announces itself as cruelty. More often, it arrives as assumption. The assumption that loyalty will absorb neglect, that patience will excuse imbalance. That silence means unawareness rather than discernment. In Eloin's story, betrayal was not just an affair, it was the belief that trust made her invisible. That because she stayed calm, she would remain uninformed. That because she endured quietly, she would never act deliberately. That belief was the real mistake. What this story reveals is not how betrayal begins, but how it ends. It ends when the person being underestimated stops reacting and starts seeing clearly. When silence shifts from endurance to choice. When observation becomes preparation. Eloin did not reclaim her life through confrontation or exposure. She reclaimed it by refusing to disappear inside someone else's certainty. She understood that restraint does not equal weakness, and that staying quiet can be a form of strength when guided by clarity rather than fear. This is the part of betrayal most people miss. It teaches you exactly where power was misplaced. It shows you how much you've been carrying alone. And if you're willing to listen instead of explode, it gives you the information you need to move forward, intact. Eloin's story is not about punishment. It's about recognition, of self, of truth, of worth that does not require permission. Sometimes the most important lesson betrayal offers is this. You don't need to announce your awareness for it to change everything. Silence is often misunderstood because it looks the same, whether it comes from fear or from resolve. From the outside, both appear calm. Both appear passive. But only one is empty. Eloin's silence was not submission. It was selection. She chose not to confront because confrontation would have centered someone else's behavior instead of her own clarity. She chose not to explain because explanation would have invited negotiation where none was deserved. She chose not to react because reaction would have scattered the very focus she needed to remain intact. This is where revenge is often misunderstood. Revenge is not always about inflicting pain or reclaiming power through damage. Sometimes it is about refusing to continue a pattern that drains you, about stepping out of dynamics that rely on your silence for their survival. about preserving yourself when the alternative is erosion. Elowen did not seek to punish. She sought to protect what remained of herself once illusion fell away. And in doing so, she reframed the entire narrative. What looked like restraint became autonomy. What looked like patience became preparation. What looked like quiet became movement. There is a lesson here for anyone who has been underestimated because they stayed composed. Silence does not have to mean endurance. It can mean discernment. It can mean timing. It can mean choosing not to hand your truth to someone who has already mishandled it. Self-preservation is not cruelty. It is clarity acted upon. And when silence is chosen with intention, it does not erase you. It reclaims you. What ultimately reshaped this story was not exposure or spectacle. It was restraint guided by awareness. Elowen did not set out to defeat someone. She set out to stop abandoning herself. In doing so, she revealed a truth that applies far beyond this marriage. People who rely on dominance often fail to notice those who are paying attention. They mistake calm for compliance. They mistake patience for ignorance. And they build certainty on that mistake. Quiet strength works differently. It does not rush. It does not explain itself prematurely. It does not require validation to remain effective. It gathers understanding, chooses timing carefully, and acts only when action will matter. Elowen's story reminds us that underestimation is not always an insult. It is often an opening. The real outcome here was not the ruling. It was the restoration of balance within one person who refused to be erased. Elowen walked away without needing applause, because she no longer measured success through reaction. She measured it through alignment, with truth, with self-respect, with peace that did not require defense. If this story stayed with you, it's likely because you've seen some version of this dynamic before. Maybe you've lived it. Maybe you're living it now. Let it remind you that clarity changes everything, and that quiet decisions, made consistently, can reshape outcomes in ways noise never could. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories of restraint, preparation, and strength that doesn't need to shout, subscribe to Midnight Story Vault. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that staying calm doesn't mean staying powerless. Sometimes the strongest move is not the loudest one. Sometimes it's simply choosing not to disappear.